This isn't just a story of heartbreak, it's a gripping tale of a bond stretched beyond its breaking point, a life weighed down by unhealed wounds, and the devastating consequences of unchecked choices. In a quiet, unassuming neighborhood, there lived a woman whose resilience had carried her through a cascade of unimaginable losses. She was the glue holding together the delicate threads of her family's legacy and faith. But even the strongest glue can weaken when pulled too far. Her grandson, a troubled young man bearing his own collection of scars, entered her life at a time when he desperately needed saving. Yet the haunting question lingered: who truly needed saving, and at what cost? This is a story that begins with love and responsibility but quickly unravels into a whirlwind of regret, guilt, and choices that would ripple through both their lives forever. Was his behavior an inevitable product of tragedy, shaped by forces beyond his control? Could she have intervened, done something, anything, to guide him back to a safer path? Or were they both ensnared in a storm and neither could escape? To unravel the truth, we must journey back to the beginning, back to the decisions, the heartbreak, and the fateful moments that led to an ending no one could foresee. I want to take a moment to thank my viewers, and especially my subscribers, for your unwavering support as we strive to bring you both the told and untold stories of true crime. If you haven't already, please subscribe to this channel and join us on this journey. Her name was Dolores Mayfield, but in her tight-knit community, she was lovingly known as Mama D, a woman of quiet strength and unshakable faith. She bore the weight of her family's legacy with a dignity that inspired those around her, even as life relentlessly tested her resolve. At 59, Dolores was supposed to be enjoying the calm of her golden years, savoring the peace she had worked tirelessly to earn. But fate, cruel and unyielding, had other plans. The tragic loss of her only child, Mariah, and her son-in-law, Julius, in a devastating car accident left her world shattered. They had been her pride, her joy, and the very essence of her purpose. In a single, horrific instant, they were gone, leaving behind their young son, Khalil, as a bittersweet reminder of all she had lost and all she now had to fight for. Dolores didn't just step into the role of grandmother, she became a mother all over again, thrust into a battle against time, trauma, and circumstances that would challenge everything she believed about love, sacrifice, and redemption. Taking Khalil in wasn't a decision Dolores made lightly. It was a choice rooted in equal parts love and duty, but deep down, she knew it was more than she should shoulder at her age. At nearly 60, she wasn't supposed to be chasing after a restless teenager, working grueling hours as a housekeeper to keep food on the table, or attending tense school meetings about behavioral issues. Yet, she did it all, without complaint. Khalil was the last piece of Mariah she had left, and for that reason alone, she carried the weight of it all. Grief hung over Dolores like an ever-present shadow, heavy and suffocating. She masked it well, hiding her sorrow behind a warm smile and an unshakable faith in God. But when the house grew quiet late at night, the tears would inevitably fall. She longed for Mariah's laughter, for Julius's easy humor, for the vibrant life her home had once known. The silence was a cruel thief, robbing her of the solace she so desperately craved, a stark reminder of all she had lost. Still, Dolores pressed on. She clung to her faith, to prayer, and to the unyielding belief in love's power to heal even the deepest wounds. She poured every ounce of her strength into raising Khalil. She taught him to say grace before meals, brought him to church every Sunday, and filled his nights with stories of his mother's compassion and his father's resilience. She wanted him to know he came from love, even if life had dealt them an unfair hand. But as Khalil grew, so did the challenges. The sweet, wide-eyed boy who once clung to her skirts in fear transformed into a young man brimming with anger and confusion. His grief morphed into rebellion, manifesting in late-night disappearances, neglected schoolwork, and an ever-defiant attitude that seemed to push her away more each day. The bond between them, once so strong, began to fray under the weight of their shared pain. Dolores fought to hold on, but the question lingered: would love and faith be enough to guide them through the storm, or were they both on a path neither could control? Dolores tried relentlessly to reach Khalil, to remind him of the values she had carefully instilled in him over the years. But her words often fell on deaf ears, drowned out by his anger and defiance. In quiet moments, she blamed herself. Was she too old to provide the care and attention he desperately needed? Had she failed him by being unable to fill the gaping void left by his parents? These unanswerable questions weighed heavily on her heart, becoming an invisible burden she carried daily. Her modest home, once a sanctuary of warmth and love, transformed into a battleground between hope and despair. Dolores prayed for Khalil endlessly, lighting candles at church and whispering fervent pleas for divine intervention. She begged God to guide her grandson back to the path of righteousness. But as the years passed, Khalil seemed to drift further and further away, like a ship lost at sea. Dolores fought to hold on, but her grip was slipping, and she could feel it. Her community regarded her as a pillar of strength, admiring her resilience and faith. Yet, they didn't see the cracks beneath her surface. They didn't see the nights she sat up waiting for Khalil to come home, the meals left untouched on the table, or the silent prayers whispered with trembling hands. Dolores carried an unshakable guilt she never shared with anyone. She felt as though she had failed not just Khalil but Mariah too. She had made a promise to her daughter, to care for her grandson and give him the life Mariah would have wanted. Watching Khalil spiral into recklessness made her feel as though she had let them both down. Yet, Dolores never stopped trying. She never stopped loving him, and she never stopped hoping that one day Khalil would find his way back, not just to her but to the man she knew he could be. But hope, as enduring as it might seem, is fragile. Even the strongest hearts have their breaking points. For Dolores Mayfield, that point was fast approaching, though she couldn't yet see it coming. Khalil Mayfield wasn't always this way. He was once the kind of boy who lit up every room he entered with his laughter. His parents, Mariah and Julius, adored him, raising him in a home filled with love, stability, and warmth. Summers with his grandmother Dolores in her modest countryside home were some of his happiest memories. During those visits, he was a picture of innocence, a boy eager to help her in the garden, thrilled by her stories of faith and resilience, and always ready with a heartfelt hug. But life has a cruel way of stealing innocence. The accident changed everything. Khalil was only 14 when it happened, a rainy night, a slick highway, and a crash that shattered his world. Mariah and Julius were gone in an instant. Khalil survived only because he was buckled into the back seat. Yet, he didn't feel lucky. From that moment on, he carried a weight no child should bear. The years that followed turned Khalil's life upside down. Moving into his grandmother's home, Dolores did everything in her power to shield him from the harshness of their new reality. But no amount of love or effort could soften the blow of losing his parents. The boy who once laughed so freely grew quiet, his eyes clouded with a grief far too heavy for his young shoulders. As Khalil grew older, the cracks in his foundation deepened. Anger replaced his sadness, and bitterness began to take root. He started seeing the world not as a place of endless possibilities but as a cruel, indifferent force. He stopped listening to Dolores's gentle advice, questioned everything she stood for, and withdrew from the love she so desperately tried to give him. By the time Khalil turned 18, his pain had fully transformed into rebellion. Late nights, missed school, and a growing crowd of equally lost friends became his new reality. These so-called friends introduced him to temporary escapes, alcohol, drugs, and reckless behavior. Each high numbed the ache in his chest, if only for a fleeting moment. Khalil's downward spiral wasn't just a series of poor choices, it was a loud, defiant declaration. He was angry at the world, angry at his parents for leaving him, and eventually, angry at Dolores. He blamed her for his circumstances, unable, or unwilling, to see the countless sacrifices she made for him. Every time she tried to reach out, to guide him back, he only pushed her further away. As he entered adulthood, Khalil's recklessness intensified. By 23, he was a man adrift, with no purpose or direction. He floated from one meaningless job to another, his nights spent in bars or on the couches of strangers. Relationships came and went, often toxic and turbulent, leaving him more broken than before. Khalil, once a boy so full of promise, had become a man consumed by anger, grief, and self-destruction, a storm no one, not even Dolores, seemed able to calm. Feeling more hollow with every passing day, Khalil embraced danger as if daring life to prove it held something better for him. Self-loathing became his constant companion, a shadow he couldn't escape. Deep down, he knew his grandmother deserved so much more than the chaos he brought into her life. He knew he was failing her. But that shame only pushed him further into his destructive habits, a vicious cycle he couldn't break. He avoided mirrors, not because of vanity but because he couldn't bear to see the man staring back at him. To Khalil, that reflection was a stranger, a man with nothing to offer and nothing to lose. To those who crossed paths with him, Khalil seemed unreachable, a soul too far gone. But to Dolores, he was still the little boy who once gazed up at her with wonder and hope in his eyes. She prayed for him tirelessly, begged him to change, and clung to the faint belief that the boy she loved was still in there, somewhere. Yet Khalil wasn't ready to be saved. His anger, his pain, and the choices he made had built a fortress around him, one that even her unwavering love couldn't penetrate. What Khalil didn't realize was that every reckless choice, every misstep, was leading him toward a moment that would change everything. A moment that would force him to confront the full weight of his pain and the wreckage he had left in his wake. A moment from which there would be no turning back. The house was quiet that morning, the kind of silence that feels oppressive, pressing down on you like a heavy blanket. Dolores sat at the small, worn kitchen table, her hands clasped tightly together, her lips moving in a silent prayer. It had been another sleepless night, another vigil spent waiting for Khalil to come home, knowing in her heart he wouldn't. The air was thick with unspoken tension, a grandmother's relentless love colliding with a grandson's defiance. When the front door finally creaked open, it was nearly dawn. Khalil stumbled in, his footsteps uneven, the faint smell of alcohol and smoke trailing behind him like a dark cloud. He didn't look her way, didn't offer a word of explanation or apology, heading straight to his room as if she wasn't even there. Dolores didn't stop him, not yet. She watched him go, her heart aching but her resolve strengthening. As the first light of the sun crept over the horizon, she decided, enough was enough. That morning, she found Khalil slouched on the couch, his face illuminated by the cold, blue glow of his phone as he scrolled aimlessly. The time had come for a reckoning, not just for him, but for both of them. Khalil's face was etched with exhaustion, his shoulders slumped as if the weight of the world rested there. He barely glanced up when she called his name. "Khalil, we need to talk," Dolores said, her voice soft but laced with the gravity of everything she had been holding back. He sighed heavily, tossing his phone aside with an air of impatience. "What now, Mama D?" She hesitated, her gaze lingering on his face as if searching for the boy she once knew, the boy who had clung to her skirt and laughed so easily. Taking a deep breath, she began, her voice trembling under the strain of her emotions. "I've watched you throw away everything your mama and daddy worked so hard to give you," she said, her words a mixture of sorrow and frustration. "I've prayed. I've begged. I've done everything I know how to do, but this," her voice faltered before she regained her composure. "This can't go on, Khalil." He shifted uncomfortably, his eyes fixed anywhere but on her. "You're 23 years old, baby," she continued, her tone now steadier but tinged with despair. "You've got to start thinking about your future. What are your plans? Where do you see yourself in 5 years? 10 years? Khalil scoffed, leaning back against the couch as if to shield himself from her words. "I don't know, Grandma. Why does it even matter?" "It matters because I won't be here forever," Dolores replied, her voice breaking as she uttered the truth she had been too afraid to say aloud. "You can't keep living like this, like you don't care about anything or anyone. You need to decide, Khalil. Decide what kind of man you want to be." The room fell into a heavy silence, her words hanging in the air like a storm about to break. Then, with a steady resolve she didn't feel but knew she needed, Dolores delivered the ultimatum. If you can't find it in yourself to change, Khalil, then you can't stay here, she said, her voice trembling with emotion. I love you, but I can't keep watching you destroy yourself under my roof. Khalil froze, her words cutting through the fog of indifference that had clouded his mind. For the briefest moment, he looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the pain etched into her face, the lines of worry carved by sleepless nights and endless prayers. But instead of softening, his gaze hardened, his defenses rising once again. Khalil's anger flared, surging through him like a storm. Are you serious right now? He snapped, his voice rising with each word. You're kicking me out. After everything I've been through, you're just going to throw me away like that? Dolores shook her head, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. I'm not throwing you away, Khalil, she said, her voice steady despite the ache in her chest. I'm trying to save you. But he wasn't listening. The words barely registered as he stood abruptly, pacing the room like a caged animal desperate to break free. You don't understand anything, he shouted, his voice raw and ragged. You never did. You think your prayers and your rules are going to fix me? You don't know what it's like to lose everything. His words sliced through her like a knife, but Dolores held her ground. I know exactly what it's like to lose everything, she said quietly, her voice trembling but firm. I lost my daughter. I lost my son-in-law. And now, Khalil, I'm losing you. Her voice cracked, the weight of her grief pressing down on her, but she refused to let him see her crumble. Khalil shook his head, muttering under his breath before storming out of the house, slamming the door behind him with enough force to rattle the walls. That night, Khalil sought refuge in the only place that seemed to make sense to him anymore, among his friends. They gathered in a dimly lit apartment, the air thick with smoke and the faint hum of muffled music in the background. Khalil poured drink after drink, his grandmother's words looping in his mind like a haunting refrain. Who does she think she is? He muttered, his words slurred. She doesn't understand me. Nobody does. His friends laughed, their voices distant echoes as they handed him another bottle, another joint. Each hit, each gulp, fueled the fire raging inside him. The anger burned hotter with every passing moment, searing him from the inside out. He felt betrayed, humiliated. How could she give him an ultimatum? As the night dragged on, Khalil's rage festered, toxic and unrelenting. The alcohol and drugs clouded his mind, blurring the edges of reality and amplifying his resentment. The thought of returning home to confront Dolores began to take root, twisting into something he couldn't shake. She wants me gone. Fine, he muttered, stumbling to his feet. But she's going to hear what I have to say first. The drive home was a hazy blur, the road stretching endlessly in front of him as his emotions spiraled out of control. By the time Khalil reached the house, the early morning hours had crept in, painting the sky in muted shades of gray. He pushed open the front door, his movements erratic, his breathing uneven. The house was quiet, but his mind was anything but. Anger and confusion churned inside him, propelling him forward. He walked down the dimly lit hallway toward her bedroom, each step heavier than the last. When he reached her door, he paused, his hand hovering over the handle. A flicker of hesitation crossed his mind, a fleeting moment of clarity. But the cocktail of substances and emotions coursing through him drowned out that small voice of reason. Without thinking, he pushed the door open, his movements sharp and unsteady, his rage leading the way. Dolores lay asleep, her breathing soft and steady, her face peaceful and unguarded. The sight should have been enough to pierce through Khalil's drunken haze, to pull him back from the brink of his rage-fueled despair. But it didn't. What happened next would unravel both their lives in ways neither of them could ever undo. Why, Mama D, he slurred, his voice wavering between desperation and anger. Why would you say those things to me? Dolores stirred awake, her eyes widening in alarm as she saw him standing in her doorway, unsteady and menacing. Khalil, what are you doing? Go back to bed, she said, her tone firm but tinged with concern. But Khalil wasn't listening. In his intoxicated state, reason had no place. His anger bubbled over, and in a moment of blind rage, he crossed a line no one could have imagined. Dolores fought back, her frail hands pushing against him, her voice pleading for him to stop. But she was no match for his strength. Her cries for mercy fell into the void of his fury and confusion. When it was over, Khalil collapsed to the floor, his head in his hands, as the gravity of his actions began to dawn on him. Dolores lay motionless, tears streaming down her face, her body trembling with shock and disbelief. Her mind raced, grappling with the unthinkable. By morning, Khalil was sober, and the clarity of his actions struck him like a tidal wave. He fell to his knees before her, his voice cracking with anguish as he begged for forgiveness. "Mama D, I'm so sorry. Please forgive me," he whispered, his tears falling freely. But Dolores said nothing. She couldn't. The pain, physical, emotional, spiritual, was too overwhelming. Her thoughts spiraled in a whirl of confusion. Should she report him? The idea meant prison for Khalil, the boy she had raised and loved despite his brokenness. Even now, after he had shattered her heart and body, the love she felt for him hadn't entirely disappeared. She was torn between justice and compassion, between protecting herself and shielding the boy she had once promised to care for. Weeks passed, but the wounds of that night lingered, unseen but ever present. Dolores avoided Khalil, speaking to him only when absolutely necessary. She poured herself into prayer, seeking solace in her unshakable faith. Yet, the weight of what had happened pressed down on her, suffocating her spirit. Then her health began to falter. At first, it was subtle, fatigue, headaches, a persistent weakness she couldn't shake. She dismissed it as age catching up with her, but as the days turned into weeks, the symptoms worsened. One morning, when she could barely summon the strength to get out of bed, she called Khalil. Despite the fractured relationship between them, he agreed without hesitation to take her to the hospital. Guilt etched every movement, his demeanor subdued and heavy. At the hospital, the doctors ran a battery of tests, their expressions growing grim as they reviewed the results. When they finally delivered the news, Dolores's world shattered once again. "You're HIV positive," the doctor said gently, the words hitting her like a hammer. "How?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The doctor's explanation was a blur, drowned out by the storm of thoughts raging in her mind. Then it hit her, a realization so horrifying she struggled to breathe. There was only one possible explanation. Her grandson. When Khalil learned of Dolores's diagnosis, confusion and fear gripped him like a vice. His heart pounded as he sat in stunned silence, the weight of her words crashing down on him. Desperate for answers, he too underwent testing, and the results confirmed his worst fear: he was HIV positive. "How?" he muttered, his voice barely more than a whisper. His mind raced through a blur of reckless encounters, countless women, and careless nights. He couldn't pinpoint the moment or the person. All he knew was that his choices had led to this: his infection, his grandmother's unimaginable suffering, and the unraveling of the only family he had left. Dolores was devastated. She looked at Khalil, the boy she had raised, the child she had poured every ounce of her love and effort into, and felt an unbearable mixture of heartbreak and rage. "I gave you everything," she whispered, her voice trembling with grief and anger. "And this is how you repay me." That night, Dolores sat in her dimly lit living room, the weight of their shattered lives pressing down on her like a physical burden. The phone sat on the table before her, a silent symbol of the choice she didn't want to make. Her hand hovered over the dial as memories of that horrific night flooded her mind, the violation, the betrayal, the pain. It was too much to bear. With trembling fingers, she dialed 911. Tears streamed down her face as she waited, each ring of the phone like a dagger to her heart. When the police arrived, Khalil didn't resist. He seemed almost relieved, as though he had been waiting for this moment, the inevitable consequence of his actions. As they placed him in handcuffs, he turned to Dolores, his eyes brimming with tears. "I'm sorry, Mama D," he choked out, his voice breaking under the weight of his guilt. Dolores couldn't bring herself to respond. Her silence spoke louder than any words could. At the police station, Khalil faced a litany of charges: rape, assault, drug possession. The stark reality of his actions finally settled in, and with it, a crushing sense of devastation. This wasn't just another mistake or a brush with trouble. This was rock bottom, and he knew it. Meanwhile, Dolores returned to an empty house, the silence deafening in its finality. She wept for the life she had tried to build, for the boy she had fought so hard to save, and for the irreparable pieces of her heart. This was the cost of his recklessness, the price of choices left unchecked, 2 lives shattered, bound together by pain and regret. A family torn apart with no clear path to redemption. Questions lingered like ghosts in the corners of her mind. Had she done the right thing by calling the police? Could forgiveness ever mend wounds this deep? What happens when love is tested beyond its breaking point? Only time could answer these questions, but for Dolores, time was running out. At the station, Khalil sat alone in the stark interrogation room, the cold fluorescent lights highlighting every line of worry on his face. Trouble wasn't new to him, but this was something else entirely. This was the reckoning he could no longer escape. This wasn't just another bar fight or a petty theft charge. This was different, far more serious. The charges laid out against Khalil were damning: rape, assault, and drug possession. The evidence against him painted a devastating picture. The medical report confirmed the assault, and his history of drug use, documented in prior arrests, told the story of a young man spiraling dangerously out of control. Khalil didn't deny what he had done, he couldn't. But his confession was riddled with excuses, each one a desperate attempt to shift the blame. "I didn't mean to hurt her," he mumbled, his voice barely audible. "I was drunk. I wasn't thinking straight." The officers weren't swayed. They had heard it all before: too many shattered lives, too many reckless decisions, too many excuses. The trial was set for 3 months later, and during that time, the small town became a buzzing hive of gossip and judgment. For Dolores, those months passed in a fog of sorrow and shame. She avoided the church she had once found solace in, skipped her regular grocery runs, and stayed hidden inside her home, unable to bear the pitying looks and whispered speculation of her neighbors. When the trial finally began, it became a spectacle that divided the community. Some sympathized with Dolores, a grandmother betrayed in the most horrific way imaginable. Others looked for reasons to defend Khalil, blaming his circumstances and past trauma for his actions. The prosecution wasted no time painting Khalil as a dangerous individual. This case, the prosecutor began, is not just about the physical assault on Miss Mayfield. It's about a pattern of behavior, a life of reckless decisions that culminated in a crime so horrific it defies comprehension. Medical experts testified in chilling detail about the injuries Dolores had sustained and confirmed that her HIV diagnosis was a direct result of the assault. Neighbors and community members were called to the stand, describing Khalil's erratic behavior, the wild parties he often hosted, and the strain he had placed on Dolores. But it was Dolores's own testimony that silenced the courtroom. She spoke softly, her voice trembling with raw emotion as she recounted the night that shattered her world. "I loved him," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I raised him as best as I could after his parents died. I gave him everything I had, even when I had nothing left to give. And this," she paused, her voice breaking, "this is how he repaid me." Her words hung heavy in the air, leaving the jury visibly moved. The weight of her heartbreak was palpable, the betrayal cutting deeper than any physical wound. Khalil's defense attorney worked tirelessly to shift the narrative. They argued that Khalil wasn't a monster but a victim of circumstance, a young man who had been thrust into unimaginable grief and instability at a critical age. "Khalil Mayfield is not defined by this crime," the defense attorney said. "He is a young man who made a series of terrible, tragic decisions. Yes, those decisions were wrong. But they were born out of deep pain and unresolved trauma. He did not choose this life, it was thrust upon him." The defense brought Khalil's former teachers and childhood friends to the stand. They described a boy who had once been kind, loving, and brimming with potential. They pointed to the accident that claimed his parents as the catalyst that set him on this destructive path, a moment that shattered his innocence and altered the trajectory of his life. The courtroom remained tense, the lines between accountability and compassion blurred. As the trial unfolded, the jury was left to grapple with a haunting question: was Khalil a villain shaped by his own choices, or a victim of circumstances too heavy for a boy to bear? The jury struggled to reconcile the image of a sweet, innocent boy with the man who had committed such an unspeakable crime. After weeks of testimony and overwhelming evidence, their deliberation took only a few hours. When they returned, the courtroom fell into a tense, expectant silence. Khalil Mayfield, the foreperson began, "We find you guilty on all charges." The words struck like a hammer, each syllable driving the final nail into a coffin. Khalil sat motionless, his head bowed in defeat. In the gallery, Dolores wept quietly, her tears an echo of the heartbreak she had carried for so long. The judge's sentence was swift and unforgiving, 20 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 15. His voice carried the weight of the law and the tragedy it sought to address. "Your actions have destroyed the life of someone who loved you unconditionally," the judge said. "While this court acknowledges your troubled past, it does not excuse the severity of your crimes." For Dolores, the verdict offered little solace. Justice had been served, but the life she had fought to build was irrevocably shattered. The grandson she had raised with love and sacrifice was now lost to her, both physically and emotionally. Her faith, though shaken, became her only anchor as she faced the daunting task of piecing together the remnants of her broken world. But the questions lingered, haunting her every thought. What would you have done in her place? Could forgiveness find a foothold in the aftermath of such betrayal, or would justice be the only path forward? These are the questions that linger long after the courtroom doors close, the kind that tug at the very fabric of human resilience. Betrayal and forgiveness are two sides of the same coin, and in the story of Dolores and Khalil Mayfield, they exist in agonizing contrast. Dolores's decision to report Khalil, to seek justice despite the depth of her love for him, was an ultimate act of sacrifice. It was her way of protecting herself while also forcing him to face the consequences of his actions. It was love, even in its most painful form. Because betrayal doesn't come from strangers, it strikes deepest when it comes from the ones we hold closest to our hearts. For Khalil, the sentence marked the beginning of a stark new reality. Prison became his world, a place where every action, every decision, was magnified in the deafening silence of regret. The walls of his cell seemed to echo with memories of Dolores's kindness and the immense pain he had caused her. Therapy sessions forced him to confront his demons, peeling back the layers of anger, grief, and trauma that had shaped his descent. The Bible became his refuge, a source of hope as he clung to the possibility of redemption. Yet, even in seeking forgiveness, the shadow of his actions loomed large, a constant reminder of the cost of his choices. In the story of Khalil and Dolores, love, betrayal, and redemption intertwine, leaving a haunting question in their wake: can even the deepest wounds be healed, or do some scars never fade? Redemption, while powerful, raises an enduring question: can it ever truly erase the damage done? Should Dolores have reported Khalil earlier, before his actions spiraled so far beyond control? Or was she justified in holding on for so long, believing that love and prayer alone could be enough to save him? The lesson here is both painful and clear. Trauma left unaddressed festers, transforming into anger, recklessness, and pain that ripples outward, touching everyone in its path. This story serves as a call to action, a reminder of the fragility of our human connections and the urgent need to seek help before it's too late. It highlights that love, while undeniably powerful, must sometimes be paired with accountability to truly heal and protect. We want to hear your thoughts. What would you have done in Dolores's position? Could you have made the same choices? Share your opinions and personal experiences in the comments below. Let's continue this essential conversation about love, betrayal, and the possibility of redemption. And don't forget to subscribe for more thought-provoking stories that explore the complexities of family, justice, and the human heart. There's so much more to uncover, and your perspective matters deeply. Tragedy tests us, but it's how we respond in its aftermath that defines us.